Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar on understanding your requirements as a hazardous and special products producer. My name is Michelle Hoover, and I am one of the communications advisors at RPRE, and I will be your moderator for today's webinar. My colleagues, Mary Cummins, who is our Deputy Registrar, and Monica Gutierrez, who is one of our Compliance and Registry officers, will also be speaking today during the webinar. So we will be answering questions throughout the webinar. To ask a question, simply click on the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, type in your question and click send. There's also an upvote feature. So to use this, simply click the thumbs up under someone's question and it'll be brought up to the top of our queue. Please use this feature if you're going to ask the same question as someone, because this just makes it more efficient for everyone. Since we have nearly 200 of you on the webinar, we will only be answering questions live that will support everyone and that are related to the content that we are reviewing today. So what we mean by this is that if you have a question that is specific to your business needs, we ask that you reach out to our compliance and registry team because they'll be able to provide a much more detailed answer for you. And when we pause for questions, please only ask questions that relate to the topics that we just covered in the previous section. If you come up with a question later on that relates to the content previously reviewed, please wait to ask it until the very end of the presentation. And any questions asked today that we cannot answer live, again, please reach out to our compliance and registry team and they would be happy to support you. If you are experiencing any technical issues, please let us know by using the chat feature. So not the Q&A feature, but the chat feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will do our best to support you. And this webinar is being recorded and will be uploaded this afternoon, as well as the presentation slides. And then everyone who registered for this webinar, whether they attended or they did not attend, will receive a follow-up email after the webinar with links to these resources. Okay, so our agenda for today. So many of you already know who we are, but we will also be reviewing and introducing ourselves for those who don't. We're then going to review the HSP regulation, which includes HSP materials covered under the reg, producer definitions, registration and reporting, as well as other producer requirements. And then we're also going to be talking about working with a pro. And then finally, we will provide some resources and open the floor for more questions. So with that being said, I will now hand it over to Mary, who will be our presenter.
Perfect. So thank you, Michelle. So as the agenda noted, we're going to be going through to start the introduction to RPRE. Next slide. Thank you. So RPRE is a regulatory authority. So that's different than what some might be familiar with in other jurisdictions, like oversight bodies, or where the regulatory oversight is done internally with the government. So RPRE is not part of government. We're a regulatory body that was created by statute, though. We were created under the RRCEA, which is the statute that sets out the framework for individual producer responsibility in Ontario. Regulations such as Blue Box or HSP then are underneath the RRCEA statute. That statute created RPRE and gives us our authority and powers, which we're going to talk a little bit about, just so that everyone is familiar with them. There's also the Waste Diversion Transition Act, which is the previous legislation that's setting out how programs such as the MHSW program is transitioned into the new RRCEA world. Next slide. So the authority's mandate is written up here. An important note for our mandate: the authority doesn't set our mandate. The authority doesn't determine what's in scope of our mandate. The ministry and the statutes decide what's part of our mandate. Two of the big ones that we're going to be talking about today are with regards to establishing and operating the electronic registry, which is where obligated parties register and report information to RPRE, and which is our main tool for compliance. I will note for the HSP regulation, it is not, there won't be an electronic registry available by the time reporting gets around, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more and some of the timelines on that. We also undertake compliance and enforcement of the legislation and regulations. And in future slides, we'll talk about what that looks like and what that means for producers. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're not government. Our compliance decisions are independent from government. We're not funded via a tax base. We're funded by the obligated parties who are part of our regulation. We're a cost recovery based organization. So that means the cost associated with overseeing the transition under the Waste Diversion Transition Act, or the cost associated with compliance and enforcement under a particular regulation are borne by those companies, those producers who have obligations under those regulations. We are a skills-based board, and what that means is we don't have stakeholder representation on our board. It is independent. The minister appoints 5 of 11, and the remaining 6 are appointed then by those 5. And we're ultimately, though, accountable to the Minister of Environment. So our accountability is outlaid in our operating agreement, which is posted on our website as well. Next slide. So what's the difference between us and ministry, especially if folks are more familiar with constructs where the enforcement happens within the ministry? So we don't write the policy or the regulation. So questions like why was this material in or out, or why does this happen, or what was the intent behind this? Those are better suited for the Ministry of Environment. So the Ministry of Environment determines the policy, sets that policy, develops the regulations, and then they're passed by cabinet. So questions about why, or we want to see a change to the regulation, or this word needs to be added. All of that are more appropriate conversations with the Ministry of Environment. There's certainly things that can come to RPRE as well. So it does help us understand some of the operations as this regulation rolls out. But our role really is about enforcing and interpreting and making sure that producers have what they need in order to comply. So once the regulation's passed, regardless of what the intent of the regulation is, regardless of what the policy was supposed to be, RPRE is left with the words of the regulation, and that is what we enforce, and that's where we go. We do not arrange for the actual collection or obligation of producers to manage any of these materials. We're the compliance and enforcement body to ensure that happens. So we're not replacing an IFO or an ISO, so like product care or AMS. We are the oversight body of the system, and producers are going to have to figure out how they're going to comply. And we're going to talk about what producer responsibility organizations are, and how producers then arrange for the recycling or collection of their materials at end of life. Next slide. So we're not going to talk, as Michelle said, we're going to keep focused today on HSP. This is just a quick note in terms of transitions to date. So we have multiple programs that have now begun their transition or completed their transition. HSP is the last regulation that we required under the RECA to fully transition under the WDTA. So the MHSW program, as you can see here, so the Municipal Hazardous or Special Waste Program, which some of you will be familiar with, is transitioning on October 1st. So the program's operated today by those IFOs end, and producers take full responsibility. You can see here we've updated on tires, batteries, transition dates. We haven't noted the number of pros yet for the last 2, is that is still moving around a fair amount as producer responsibilities or organizations are registering, but we'll talk about that as well. Next slide. So this is an overview of then how we all work together. So you've got, we've spoken about this a little bit, you've got the government, they're the ones developing the policy, deciding the legislation, approving any changes to the regulation that would be required. RPRE is enforcing those regulations. Right? We're doing so through an approach of communications, which we're going to talk about as well, and what that looks like. And we have the powers to enforce, and we're going to talk about how we use those powers too, so people understand. but we're not the ones ultimately deciding what that policy was. Now we're just the ones that we're left with the words in the regulation to interpret where needed to provide the guidance so producers are able to comply. You've got the producers. Now, not to be confused with the term of manufacturer, producers are stewards, right? For the most part, if you were a steward under a previous program, you're likely going to be a producer under these regulations. And we'll define who the producers are for these regulations and what's different between an IFO operated program, so MHSW, or if you're a part of Product Care or AMS, and going into the regulation. And then you have these producer responsibility organizations, which we'll also talk about in more detail, who are a lot like those IFOs, who are going to provide the services to assist producers to be able to comply. And they're doing so by working with other service providers. So that's the haulers, the processors of these materials. Next slide. So we'll pause there on questions to see if anybody has anything that they want to ask about, whether it be RPRE's compliance and enforcement powers. We're much like any other regulator. So if you are familiar with any other regulators, whether that's OMVIC, the people who regulate car dealers in this province, or food inspectors, whatever it might be, we're much like that. So it's a different construct than what producers have been used to in the past. So I really want to make sure folks note that. We have inspection powers, the ability for an inspector to send an information requirement to regulated entities, and they have to comply with those requirements. We have the ability to search, to audit, just like any other regulatory body that you may be familiar with. As I said, this is very different than what you might be used to under other IPR programs. So I'll pause there and see.
So Mary, we received a question from Stephen asking, will RPRA interpret the regulations?
Yeah, so where there is a need, where there's clarity that's lacking. So what does a particular word mean? RPRA provides that clarity. Ultimately, if you disagree, you have avenues just like you would with any other regulator. So there, and those are outlined in the statute in terms of appealing our compliance orders to the to the environmental review tribunal, things like that. So we provide that clarity, we provide those interpretations to help people comply, but we aren't reading in whole new sections of a regulation or changing the regulation itself. That's we have the words in the regulation to work with only.
We have another question from Kimberly asking what our process is for finding free riders in the system and holding them accountable for their share.
Absolutely. So I'm not going to get into the details of our compliance plans around free riders. However, RPRA approaches compliance using a modern regulator approach. It's a risk-based approach to compliance. So what that means is anything that's considered high risk, high likelihood, risks the success of the program is in the top right-hand quadrant of our risk matrix. Free riders live there. So a high amount of our team's resources are dedicated to finding free riders and bringing them in compliance. As I said, we have all of those tools I mentioned earlier in order to do so. So inspection, we can show up to an office and require them to produce documents that we need in order to determine if they're a producer or not. We have the ability to issue compliance orders, so requiring them to register, report about particular timelines and dates. Those are enforceable by courts. We also have the ability to issue administrative penalties should non-compliance not occur, and we have the ability to prosecute for non-compliance. So we have quite a few compliance and enforcement tools in our toolkit. To date, our primary approach to compliance has been something called communicating for compliance. The idea that if you remove the barriers for compliance, you communicate, you help people understand how they're going to comply. To be honest, the vast majority of people comply. People want to comply with the laws, especially companies. It's rare that companies don't want to comply when they go through that process. Still going to happen, all right? We're still going to have folks that don't, and that's why we have all of our compliance and enforcement tools. But to date, we haven't had to issue a single compliance order to achieve compliance. And if you take a look at our annual report, you'll see with something like the tires program that was out for some time now, the amount of free riders we bring in every year.
We have one last question, and it is, what triggers compliance or enforcement activities?
So I think compliance is communication, right? So something as simple as us calling to help a producer understand their obligations is compliance, right? It's compliance work. So the entirety existence of RPRE is what triggers compliance work. I think the key part of your question is what triggers enforcement, which is when we've determined there's non-compliance. And that's genuinely what triggers it. So when we've determined that there is non-compliance, when our communicating for compliance tools have failed, so removing the barriers to comply, helping them understand, have failed, we may have somebody who willfully isn't going to comply, that triggers enforcement actions. And enforcement actions are things like investigations, prosecutions, administrative penalties. As I said, we haven't had to do that. We know from our experience with our other regulators that will happen. But right now, we have had an incredibly high degree of compliance with these regulations by communicating with Ontario companies who do genuinely want to comply with these regulations.
Thanks, Mary. So we have another question, but I'm going to ask it in the next section as it relates to what we're about to review for producers. So let's move forward.
Perfect. Okay, so let's quick overview, high level of the HSP reg, and then we're going to dive into different aspects of it in more detail. So the reg was filed and was final on June 8th. The transition of the MHSW program is occurring on September 30th. That includes operations ceasing for AMS, Product Care, and SodaStream, who are industry stewardship plans. So folks who are part of those may not be aware that there's the MHSW program, but then there's these things called industry stewardship plans, which are unique to the MHSW program. They didn't exist in any of our other IFO programs, where organizations that were able to operate a program that was similar to or better than the MHSW program were able to operate that program and have been doing so on behalf of stewards for a number of years now. Those programs also cease. Those ISPs will be no more on September 30th. So on October 1st, HSP producers are becoming individually accountable and financially responsible, which means you'll have to have some requirements with registration to RPRE, as well as figuring out what your individual requirements are under this regulation, and then determining who and how you're going to meet them. Next slide. So what are those regulations, or what are those requirements? So many of these we're going to talk about today. We're focusing our today talk primarily on the things you need to know about your requirements over the next few months. So folks who may have questions, about verification required in 3 years, we won't be covering those topics in any form of detail today. More information is going to be provided over the coming months and year. But at a high level, the regulation requires collection requirements for materials, setting up collection sites and operating them, management requirements, which includes managing what those sites produce, promotion and education to consumers in Ontario about the ability to return these products either for safe disposal or recycling or recovery, recycling efficiency rate requirements of processors. So folks who actually process, let's say it's paints and coatings, have to achieve particular efficiency rates at those at their facilities. That's really about a mass balance. What's going in, and then what percentage of that is actually being covered. So there's requirements in the regulation for that as well. Registration, which is a huge component. We talked about that in its interaction with our electronic registry, which will be spreadsheet based this year for HSP. We have registration for producers, who is our primary audience today, as well as service providers. We have been speaking to service providers and providing them webinars as well. Producers have to report supply data to RPRE. RPRE is the only organization that producers actually have to report supply data to. It's really important to know that. that the regulation requires the supply data to come to RPRA so that we can determine what is each individual's producer's responsibility. We can take compliance and enforcement activities if required. We can ensure that the accuracy of the data between multiple pros. So because this program and all of these regulations can have multiple pros, your pro's not going to have necessarily visibility in what a producer is reporting who's with a different pro and that data and those brands. RPRA does. So the idea that of reporting supply data to your pros, I just want to make sure everyone understands that that's a market-based negotiation. Your pros may require that data for whatever reasons the pros tell you they require that data. It is not for your regulatory requirements in this province. There's also producer and service provider performance reporting. So later on, saying, did I actually meet what I was told, RPRA told me I needed to do, and auditing, verification, and record keeping. Now, the HSP regulation has multiple materials, and the obligations for these differ depending on the material. We'll talk about that a little bit at a fairly high level. We will be putting up an FAQ on our website shortly. So when we get to talking about more resources, we'll get there. That actually includes a chart. So if somebody is curious and wants to know exactly, what their requirements are for each of these materials, there'll be an easy reference for you to use. Next slide. So let's talk about what the HSP materials are and what's included in this regulation. So many of these terms for folks who are part of the MHSW program or AMS or product care, you'll be familiar with. So it includes oil filters, oil containers, antifreeze solvents, paints and coatings, fertilizers, pesticides, refillable and non-refillable pressurized containers, including propane containers. What is new, what you may not have seen under, what you didn't see under the MHSW program is mercury containing devices. Right. You'll note this does not say lighting. I want to make sure folks understand lighting is actually under the electronics regulation. So mercury containing lighting is covered under a different regulation. Next slide. So, and the container. So a key question that a lot of folks asked. So the following material definitions listed here include the product's primary packaging. So what that means is that if you are an antifreeze producer and you supply antifreeze, first you'll see from the bottom bullet, it doesn't matter what container size you supply it in, all antifreeze is captured by the definition. So, think of big tanker antifreeze obligated, 3.78 liter jug that you're going to the store and a consumer's purchasing off the shelf, that antifreeze in there is obligated. When the container is less than 30 liters or kilograms in terms of capacity for antifreeze, the weight of the container itself is also obligated. So big tanker, not obligated as a container. The HDP 3.78 liter jug of antifreeze that you would purchase is obligated. Antifreeze in both of those are. Paints and coatings. So the paints and coatings is included in the definition itself, as well as the container, right? Provided the containers has a capacity of 30 liters or 30 kilograms or less. So unlike antifreeze with the tanker, there's no tanker of paint that you folks have to worry about. Pesticides, it's the same as paints and coatings, as is solvents. It does not include this regulation, primary packaging. It's made of corrugated and boxboard boxes, film, shrink wrap, or printed materials. So what think about in the concept of an oil filter coming in a cardboard box wrapped in an LDP film. The oil filter is obligated under the HSP regulation. That boxboard and that LDP film is going in the blue bin and is obligated under the blue box regulation. All right. So it can be a little confusing for the containers and where am I supposed to be obligated for them. It really is about the logical approach of an antifreeze container when it's emptied is still a household hazardous waste, right? If it's a container in my home, whereas that oil filter, that box board is not and is going into the blue bin. So anybody who has specific products, questions, wants to be sure, I think if you follow the points on this slide, you should be able to figure it out. But if you've got something specific and you want us to help you figure that out, contact Registry at RPRA and we'll be able to let you know under which regulation do you have obligations. Next slide. So some key changes to the definition of HSP materials from what you may be used to. We've already said that barometers, thermometers, and thermostats are net new. So I won't talk about those, but they are changes. Antifreeze also now includes factory fill. So what that means for our antifreeze producers is that if they were supplying antifreeze to a car manufacturer under the previous programs, they would not have been reporting that, because that car manufacturer would then be putting it into the new vehicles to be supplied into market. That is now obligated. Solvents that are captured by the definition are obligated regardless of how they were marketed. So there were carve-outs under some of the programs about what was the intended purpose, or how is this solvent marketed. If you match the definition of solvent, you are a solvent. Paints and coatings also now include some other types of paints. That is something that the paints folks need to be aware of when they're taking a look at the data. So we're going to talk about how you get your data and things you need to be doing and thinking about that data now. And so this slide should be useful for that for you. So if I'm an antifreeze producer and I'm pulling my data for the years that's required, because I happen to be one of the material categories that require supply reporting. Not all of them do, as I mentioned, but antifreeze does. And I'm pulling that data to report to RPRE. I need to think, was anything in these years also factory fill that I supplied, in which case I need to include that into my data to RPRE. Next slide. Okay, so we'll pause here for questions about high-level HSP regulation. Like I said, we're going to get into the details of the collection requirements, the management requirements, the RER in a little bit. So if you have detailed questions about those, there's more sections coming, but very specifically about the definitions of any of those HSP materials.
Okay, so we have a few questions. So first one is an aerosol spray coating considered a paint and coating or a non-refillable pressurized container?
Is an aerosol paint and coating considered a paint and coating? Yes, it's paint and coating, not pressurized container.
Another one is producer supply data to RPRE. Does this include or exclude the weight of the container?
So let's so we'll review it. It depends on the material, right? So that's a generic question. But if we go back to the container slide, and we're going to talk about how you get your weights for all of this in a minute. So if you are antifreeze, paints and coatings, solvents, and pesticides, the weight of your container is also obligated. Okay, how you report that, how that's going to happen, we'll talk about in a bit. But no, if you are a producer for those 4 materials, your container is also obligated under this regulation.
Okay, if antifreeze is used in factory fill, what antifreeze was actually disposed of?
I'm not really sure how to answer that. I think the question is, if it's being put into the vehicle, how do we know what antifreeze is being recovered? Not sure if that's the question or not. But ultimately, you're obligated to report all of the antifreeze, including the factory fill antifreeze. In terms of how it's recovered, that's up to those producers.
If the product in the aerosol container is non-toxic, non-solvent, non-hazardous, does it still fall under aerosol?
If it matches the definition, yes. So if you are paints and coatings and you match the definition of paints and coatings, there's nothing in the regulation that says that paints and coatings are toxic or anything like that in that definition. If you match the definition of a paint and coating, you are obligated under this regulation, yes.
Are producers of thermostats that do not contain mercury subject to HSP obligations?
That is a great question, and we're going to talk about that next, I think, in terms of who is a producer. Who is a producer for those thermostat containers is something we're going to talk about in just a moment.
Do touch-up paint sticks required to be reported?
I think you're talking about those touch-up paint sticks that you can purchase and put on flooring and things like that. It depends on whether it matches the definition of paints and coatings. You can certainly send that to the team and they can provide you direction on whether that is captured or not. What I would say is if it was captured on the product care definitions, it is likely captured now. This regulation didn't remove anything, it added. So if you were reporting that material under PCA, you would continue to.
Does factory fill antifreeze include cars imported into Canada?
So that would depend on the supply chain network of the antifreeze producer themselves. So if you are an antifreeze producer and you are supplying antifreeze to another jurisdiction, outside of Canada, and then those cars are coming back into Canada, you can give us a call and we can help you figure out whether or not that's something that you need to report and include into your data. But the obligation falls not to the car manufacturer, to the antifreeze producer.
Okay, the question is, are empty plastic and metal paint containers permitted to be put in the blue box? I think the question would be, are they under the HSP regulation?
Actually, I think it's a little different. They are under the HSP regulation. Some municipalities in Ontario allow those containers to, when they're empty, to be put in the blue bin. That is completely separate from the obligation that exists under this regulation for those containers to have an individual producer responsibility. Ultimately, the blue box regulation is also in the process of transitioning, and it very clearly states that anything that's covered under this regulation is not covered under the blue box regulation. That said, during the transition period of the blue box regulation, municipalities can continue to direct their consumers and residents to put empty containers into their blue bin. Yes.
Okay, and then we have a question for clarification. Can we please clarify that all solvents, regardless of volume, are included, but only containers that are less than 30 liters are included?
No, only solvents supplied in a container that has a capacity less than 30 liters or 30 kilograms are obligated. And in that case, both the container and solvent is obligated.
Okay, great. This is more of a statement and rather than a question, but someone just asking that we provide an exhaustive list as best as we can prior to the registration deadline.
We will not be providing an exhaustive list. We can provide examples, but there will never be an exhaustive list provided. Stewardship Ontario Product Care AMS also did not provide an exhaustive list. They very specifically said it was not exhaustive. We can provide examples. We are here to help producers. So if they have a material that they're curious about, whether it has an obligation or not, they can actually just send it to Registry at RPRE and we can help them with that. Ultimately, as I said, if it's been obligated under the previous WDTA programs through AMS Product Care RSO, it is obligated now. So that's your starting point. And then it's a matter of, are there any additions?
Okay. Do industrial paints specifically mean industrial maintenance products or architectural products that both residential and professional customers can use?
We're going to talk a little bit about a change to the definition in terms of sector to be supplied into in another slide that I think we'll get at the answer to that question. That's more about the sector supplied into. So we'll talk about that coming up.
Okay, great. So those are all the questions related to the slides that we just covered. Okay. Some I will ask once we review who a producer is. Perfect. So we'll just move forward.
Okay, so producer hierarchies. So what this means is, so now you know you have material that fits the definition under the HSP regulation. How do you know if you're the producer? Right. So the first step in that is for these materials specifically on this slide listed above, you need to ask yourself, am I the brand holder of that material? So let's say it is paints and coatings. The question becomes, am I the brand holder of that paint and coating? Right? If the answer to that is yes, your next question is, am I resident in Canada? Right? If you're not sure if you have residency in Canada, we can help you figure that out. But from there, you can say, I am very likely the producer if I'm the brand holder with residency in Canada. If you know that the person you're not the brand holder, you know that you're getting the paint from outside of Canada, right? And you have residency in Ontario, you are the importer of that HSP, that paint, which then makes you the producer. Not both of you, it's a hierarchy. So brand holder resident on Canada. If no brand holder resident in Canada, then it falls to the person who imports it, who has residency in Ontario. If there is no company who has a residency in Ontario, who is importing the product, let's say they have residency in Ontario and they are directly marketing it to the consumer. So think of an online sale where Mary can go onto a website and purchase the same paint, and it's coming to me. Then that marketer, that online sales is the one, the forum is the one that's obligated. And then in the case where that online forum does not have residency in Ontario, they become the one obligated. So again, brand holder resident in Canada. If there's no brand holder resident in Canada, then it falls to somebody who has residency in Ontario, who's importing it from outside Canada. If there's no one importing it because it's being directly supplied to a consumer's home, or any resident in Canada, it doesn't have to be a consumer's home. As I said, we're going to talk about the sectors in a bit. So that could be a business or a contractor. Then it falls to that forum, that online sales. Whether or not they have residency determines which one of them is obligated. Next slide. For the materials, well, we go to the slide. For the materials, for thermometers, there we go. For mercury containing barometers, thermometers, and thermostats, this question was asked. So whoever asked that question, and I said it was coming up, here's your answer. The producer is the brand holder who has residency in Canada, who supplied, historically not continued to supply, who supplied the mercury containing barometer, thermometers, or thermostats. If there are no brand holders with residency in Canada who supplied mercury containing barometers, thermometers, and thermostats, then the brand holder becomes a resident in Canada who supplies those materials that does not contain mercury. Right now, RPRE, so I want everyone to sit tight on mercury containing devices. RPRE is doing work directly with the folks who hit that first bullet, right? And we will contact folks in the second bullet if there is no one in the first bullet. So if you do not receive something from us saying that you may be a producer for mercury containing devices, even though you do not supply these devices that contain mercury, unless you receive that notification from us, do not worry or think about mercury containing devices. If you are a company who is a brand holder and has residency in Canada of barometers, thermostats, and thermometers who previously contained mercury, we will be reaching out to you because you do hit the first part of the hierarchy. If we don't reach out to you, do contact us as well, because the obligation is still yours to make sure you're participating. For fertilizers, it's brand holder with residency in Canada. So it's a little bit simpler. There's no importer, there's no marketer or anything. Next slide. So again, as I said, so you've got this data from PCA, SO, or AMS, depending on the material, and you've asked yourself, let's say you're a paint producer and you've got that data and you know, okay, well, during the webinar, I was told nothing's taken out. So I know that this is my start of the data I need for paints. Now I need to ask myself, is there anything that's newly obligated under regulation that I need to consider to include in my paints? You also need to ask yourself, has anything changed with what I was previously reporting to SO, Product Care, AMS that would change my obligation for these materials, that where I'm no longer the producer? So that's questions of, were you reporting any of that material to AMS, PCA, or SO because you were an importer of the material? If that's the case, you may not be the producer for it anymore if you were importing it from within Canada and the brand holder has residency here in Canada. So something for you to sort of ask yourself. The answer to that question might be no, I'm the brand holder of everything. So it's fine. And then the second question to sort of ask is around, or the second question point to be aware of isn't something the producers have to ask themselves, is it's just a new layer to the hierarchy. And that's to capture some free riders that would have existed in the previous programs that can now be captured through this regulation, which is around the online forums and marketers and direct to sale. So you don't have to ask, were any of my materials coming from that, and what is that why I'm obligated? Rather, that's going to create new producers. We will be contacting SO, AMS, and PCA stewards. We've already been sending them emails. That's how you received information on this webinar. You may have obligations. You may be able to take what you reported to an IFO, your IFO or one of those ISOs, and just report that directly to us. There may be changes that we're going through today that you need to consider that increases, very unlikely decreases, unless it's a case where you're no longer the producer at all because you were the importer and now there's a brand owner who has residency in Canada. So we're reaching out. That said, if you think you may be a producer and you haven't been hearing from us, you haven't received these emails, maybe this webinar was just forwarded to you from someone, do contact our team so that they can help you. If you weren't a producer under the programs previously, but maybe now you are because you're a brand holder resident in Canada and you were importing everything into Ontario, also contact us so we can start these conversations. Next slide. Perfect. Turn it over.
Yes, okay, so we have a few questions here. So first, as a producer that sells to warehouses, we do not know where our products end up. So there's no way to determine what stays in Ontario and what is shipped across Canada. We do not know if the product ends up in a commercial business or home, as our products are used in both. An example they gave is I can email a customer and they can say our best guess is 80% commercial, 20% retail. Is this enough information if they get audited?
Okay, so you're going to
I can help you with that.
Perfect.
Yeah. So if you do not really know where your products are really end up because you ship it to a warehouse and then from that warehouse gets shipped maybe like to some places in Ontario and other places across Canada, we do have on our registry procedure a way where you can estimate what you have supplied into Ontario, and that registry procedure is posted on the website. This is a very easy formula that you can apply, which is based on population. And if you have any questions about the formula, or if you can't find the information on the website, you can also let us know and send us an email to registry@rpre.ca.
Perfect.
Thank you. Another question from HRAI is, if the thermostat producer has never manufactured devices containing mercury, do obligations still apply? Mary, they're still unclear of the second bullet point that
it only applies if there is no company that has residency in Canada that did supply those devices containing mercury. So that second bullet only applies if the first bullet doesn't exist. In the cases of thermostat, I can tell you the first bullet exists, so the second bullet is irrelevant. So producers of thermostat today who never supplied mercury containing thermostats are not obligated. The other two, for thermometers and barometers, we're still doing some work on. So specifically for HRAI, I can confirm that it'll be the producers who have residency, who are the brand owners who did supply mercury containing devices.
If someone reports through PCA for their non-retail sales, how does this change their reporting?
Right. So, Monica, do you want to?
Yeah, so I think for the new regulation, this is going to change a little bit, because if you are the producer of the products, you are the one who will be registering with us and will be reporting to us. If you will be working with PCA as your pro as well, and you will be also reporting to them, that would be separate. But I think because this is now an individual producer responsibility framework, every producer has to report to us. Like, there's no remitters agreements under the new regulation.
Right. And to sort of further a theme I'm hearing, we're going to talk about in a little bit, this regulation no longer differentiates between residential sector or IC&I. Everything is obligated. So you don't have to, there's no question of, was this paint and coating supplied to a resident, or was this paint and coating supplied to a huge contractor? It's all obligated. So that changes the dynamic to some of these questions as well, that I'm hearing questions around, supplying to a warehouse, and that warehouse is supplying to large contractors, and that warehouse is supplying to residents. Everything, regardless of the sector, is obligated, but we're going to cover that more in a bit.
If we ship our materials to another province, how do we report and charge fees?
I can help you with that one as well. If you are shipping your materials to a different province, that means that those materials do not have to be reported to RPRE, and we do not mandate you to charge fees on that. So if you have paid fees to a pro on those products, you will have to talk to your pro. But we do not mandate you to disclose any fees or to pass down any fees. If you decide to pass down those fees, it would be your decision on how you manage those fees with your pro.
Apologies, my mouse has a mind of its own. Another question is, if you have licensed your brand to another company and have no involvement in managing the business the license is doing, are you still considered the producer because it is your brand? Or does the obligation fall to the licensee?
So if this is like a private label situation where you are the manufacturer, but then you are specifically manufacturing a private brand to a different company, then the other company will be the obligated party if they fit the definition of a producer of that specific material.
You can also find the definition of brand holder in our statute. It means the person who owns or license a brand. That might help you figure that out as well.
Yes, I think I posted the definition of one of the questions. So if you also go to the Q&A section, you may find the answer, but if there's too many questions there, you can also find the definition of brand holder under the RCA Act.
Someone's asking for clarification on what we meant when we said there are no more remitters agreements. Are they no longer permitted?
So I can help with that a bit. So remitter agreements under the previous program were things where a steward would say all of the retailers are going to report. So that concept does not exist under this regulation. The producer is obligated to report what was supplied to those retailers. It's not about what was supplied to the consumer, when it was supplied, or the moment it was supplied. As the producer, when I supplied it into this province, that's when it became obligated, and that's what's actually reported, not when it's supplied at point of sale. And so, but from there, if a producer wants to piecemeal gather their data from different companies. If there's issues about how to get the information, there's some FAQs on our site to help you figure that out. And we can talk to you about how you can compile that data and get that information if it is piecemeal across multiple parties. But no, the obligation occurs when a producer supplies this material, not when a retailer sells it to someone.
Okay, there's another question for you, Mary. If the brand owner has a joint venture in Canada for non-refillable pressurized containers, would a distributor still be the producer?
I actually don't understand that question. So if that's a question about your legal structure or very specific, it sounds very specific to you. I would recommend, as Michelle said at the beginning, those questions shouldn't be addressed here. We'd have follow-up questions about the legal relationship between those parties. That should come to registry at rpra.ca. That's not a question for everyone. That's a question for one company who sounds like they have a very specific structure.
Okay. We have a question from Monica. So if someone were to ship to a warehouse outside of Ontario, so to a different province, and then ships back into Ontario to their stores, who is responsible to report?
Yes, and this is actually a good question. So you can refer back to the producer hierarchy. So depending on the producer hierarchy, if you are the brand holder of that product and you have residency in Canada, then you are still responsible for that product because that product has been shipped back into Ontario. So everything that's been supplied into Ontario will be obligated, and the responsible party is the brand holder that has residency in Canada. In the case of, like, for example, categories A and B, for instance.
Great. So that's all of our questions that we're going to answer live. So I'll move forward.
Okay, perfect. So let's talk a little bit about some of the producer requirements that exist. So one of the producer requirements that exists, so outside of determining what am I obligated for, am I the right producer for this? Once you've sort of figured out, okay, I am the producer and I know what I'm obligated for, what other requirements exist under the regulation? And this depends on the material. So for instance, in this case, you've got up top the materials that this affects. If you're a producer for these materials, right, during the period of October 1st, 2021, which is approaching in a few weeks, to December 31st, 2022, you are responsible for ensuring that at least the same number of collection sites that existed at the end of the MHSW program continue to exist. Not the same collection sites, just the same number, and in the same municipalities. If it's collection events, you have to make best efforts to ensure that those numbers of events are continued to held in the community as were held in 2020. We're going to talk about how you as a producer does this. That's going to become clear as we continue with this presentation. So how you get help and where you can go. You can do this on your own. You can absolutely contact us and say, I want to try to participate on my own without getting help from anyone else. But there are ways that you can get help to achieve this. There's also a requirement for large producers, and we're going to define what those are for those materials in another slide, to ensure that there's a call-in number provided for things like First Nations for pickup. There are new collection requirements starting January 1st of 2023. We will not be talking about those today. As I said at the onset, this is about what do you need to know in this case, few weeks. We'll provide additional compliance guidance over the next few months and year regarding other requirements that exist in that regulation. Next slide. So if you're mercury containing devices or refillable propane containers, as of October 1st of this year, so in a few weeks, you're offering a call-in service. The details of that are in the regulation, but also we are talking to associations and producers of these materials so that they understand what that obligation looks like. If you are a fertilizer producer and you have determined that from this presentation, you have no collection requirements, no requirements under the regulation to set up a collection system. Next slide. You also have management requirements, again, differing between materials. So we've identified them here. So for all materials except for fertilizers, as of October 1st, you've got this collection system that's out there, and fertilizers is the only one without a collection system of some sort. Materials that are collected must be processed within 3 months of being collected. So you've got this obligation, except for fertilizers, to say there is a system of some sort that I've created, whether it's a call-in system, whether it's ensuring that the similar system to what existed before in terms of sites and events exists. That system needs to be operating and collecting as of October 1st. You can't shut it down, and there's requirements in the regulation that speak to that. And everything that's collected has to be then processed within 3 months, right? Further to that, all materials except for fertilizers and now refillable propane, so adding on, also have to ensure that it's processed by somebody who meets a particular recycling efficiency rate. So the regulation outlines different numbers to say, if I'm a paint processor, I have to hit X percentage recycling efficiency rate. That efficiency rate is essentially, as I said earlier, like a mass balance, the amount of paint coming in, what percentage of it is being recovered. So what this means is, while there's not strict management targets, if you will, it's something that's sort of old world language. Producers of these materials, with the exception of fertilizers, have to have a collection system that's fully operational, and not turning anyone away, not charging fees for. All of that is outlined. They have to make sure that it's processed within 3 months, and they have to make sure it's sent to a processor who meets a particular standard, a percentage of recovery rate. And then in terms of oil filters and non-refillable pressurized containers only, they have a particular, what sort of that older concept that some folks will be more familiar with, a management requirement to hit. And that management requirements based on their average supply data provided. And they have to report, everybody has to provide some form of performance report. It just depends on what your obligations are. For materials, for oil filters and pressurized, non-refillable pressurized containers, when they report their performance, it's talking about how much of that stuff that they collected was actually managed as well. Next slide. There's promotion education requirements in the regulation for producers. So this is this idea, you've got a collection system, always operating. Everything that it is collected from it has to be processed within 3 months. It has to be processed by a processor who meets a particular standard. How does that collection system get fed? Through the promotion and education components. So there are requirements on producers about the information that they need to make available to consumers. And I use the word consumer to mean, as defined in the regulate or in the statute. Consumer means business. It means personal household use, institutional. All of those uses are covered by the word consumer. So don't get hung up on the word consumer thinking household. That's not what consumer is defined as in this regulation. So with the exception of refillable pressurized containers and refillable propane containers, everyone has promotion and education requirements. Next slide. So Monica talked a little bit about this earlier. RPRE does not have anything to do with the resource recovery charges that a producer may choose to break out onto their invoice. Resource recovery charges, sometimes referred to as eco fees, are the decision, much like any other cost that a business incurs, of how they present that cost to their consumers. However, if a producer does choose to identify a separate fee to consumer, particular regulatory requirements kick in. They need to identify the person responsible for imposing that charge. They need to do that correctly, so that the answer for the person responsible for imposing a cost is the producer, not the government, not RPRE. It's the producer is chosen to put that cost there. And they need to communicate to the consumer about how the charge is actually used, what that cost is being used for, to recoup the cost the producer incurred to collect, reduce, reuse, recycle, and recover that particular HSP. Next slide. So there are some exemptions in the regulation. We spoke earlier very briefly about the idea of call-in center happening October 1st for some material categories, and that call-in number for, if there's over 100 kilograms worth of a particular material, First Station being able to call and get a pickup. Only large producers of those materials have that obligation, and they're noted here. Then you've also got, so if you are between 3.5 to 100 for tons for oil filters, you do not have an obligation to ensure there's a call-in number set up. Okay. Now there is an exemption level, and we're going to talk about what that means. So that's that left hand, exempt less than. So if you supply less than this amount in tons in the previous calendar year, you do have some exemptions from requirements in the regulation. Next slide, I'm going to tell you what those are. You would be exempt from requirements related to setting up or operating a collection system in 2023. So if you are exempt, if you are a producer who supplies less than 3.5 tons of oil filters, you still have to ensure there's a collection system operating on between October 1st to December 31st. You're not exempt from that requirement. However, come January 1st of 2023, when the transitional period is over, you no longer have a requirement to participate in that collection system that's set up. There were no exemption levels under previous programs. So really you are continuing to operate. Really what this means is that you're continuing to operate and participate in the collection system. You probably have been for quite a while, since 2008. You also are exempt from management requirements. If you've got less than, continuing with this example of the oil filter producer with 3.5 tons, you don't have management requirements, right? Then you also are exempt from some P&E requirements, all P&E requirements if you have less than 3.5 tons. However, you are not exempt from registration and reporting to RPRE. So you still are required to register and report your supply data to RPRE. Next slide. Okay, so we'll pause there for questions about other requirements. As I said, we're going to talk about how you meet those requirements in a minute. Any questions about what those requirements are or what a producer is exempt from in terms of those requirements?
We currently don't have any related to that, so we'll just give them another minute or two to see if any more come in.
Could be because they're all just waiting to find out how they meet the requirements, not so much what they are, which makes sense. Okay, why don't we move on just in the interest of time? And if you have questions, as Michelle said, you can type them in and we will get to them hopefully.
We got one,
Oh,
Mary. Sorry.
Perfect.
So for category E call-in service, is there a minimum weight to pick up?
I'd have to look at the regulation. I believe there is, and it would be outlined in the regulation for that section. So Monica, if you want to see if you can pull that up and answer that question, including the section of the regulation in the chat.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Thank you. Next slide. Unless there's other questions on this. Perfect. How you meet these obligations and requirements now. So as I said, it's perfectly possible that you are a producer, you figured this out, and you have a way of complying with the regulatory requirements independently of working with what we call a producer responsibility organization. So let's talk about producer responsibility organizations. These are private companies. They can be for-profit, not-for-profit. They are companies that are see a business opportunity, right? So they are not regulated the same way an IFO would have been, or the same way an ISO like Product Care or AMS would have been, or overseen the same way that they would have been by Waste Diversion Ontario or RPRE. They are companies who come out and say, I can help a producer do all those things that Mary just spoke about in the previous section. Right? I can help them establish and operate a collection and management system. I can make sure that they've got a P&E system in place. I can help them in terms of their reporting requirements, making sure that the processors, that the material is only going to a processor that hits that RER, and that processor is reporting to RPRA. I can make sure that I'm submitting the audits to RPRA for them to tells RPRA how they achieved their compliance. As I said, a processor retained from a producer directly wouldn't be a pro, because it is possible that perhaps a producer says, I'm going to hire my own processor. I'm going to do this. I'm going to set up my system. I'm going to make sure all of this is going to the right place. Depending on the regulation, we actually do have producers doing this on their own as well. HSP hasn't rolled out. We'll see if producers want to do this on their own, but that's up to them. But if they don't, they have the ability to try to hire a producer responsibility organization. And I use the word hire. This is different than an IFO. With Stewardship Ontario, you had to join them. You had to report and pay fees to them in accordance with their steward rules, unless you were joining an approved industry stewardship plan like Product Care or AMS's, which was similar to or better than, right? So you didn't really you had a little bit of choice in the sense that you could join AMS or Product Care for some of those services. Now you have a full choice, right? There are multiple competing pros. They're going to be on the next slide. And all of those pros want your business to help you comply with these requirements. RPRA is not reviewing their finances. RPRA is not saying that they have a viable plan like other jurisdictions do. RPRA is not saying that they will actually achieve compliance for you. You need to determine, just like you would when you hire any other vendor for anything you do in your business, that they're actually going to deliver on what they say they're going to deliver on. Right? So it's really important that producers understand this change. You're going to register with RPRA. Everybody registers. We're going to talk about that, and what information you give differs. The requirements you have differ. Once you know what your requirements are, you need to take another step. You need to say, how am I going to meet these requirements? Next slide. I'm just going to show you who the currently registered pros are. So they're listed here, and you can see for what material they provide services. You choose. You could go to them and say, give me RFPs, give me, quotes, or you could just pick whichever. It's entirely up to you and how you procure your services, just like you would procure services for anything else you do in this business. So it's really, really key that the producers understand that and understand it's their choice. And it's a private marketplace conversation. So between a producer and a pro, the terms, what data you need to report to them, the costs, all of it is between you and the pro, and RPRA is not involved in that. Same way that you would with any other vendor that you procure for services. I will note, if you want to procure the services of pros, you have obligations starting on October 1st. So you should be talking to pros now about what you may need them to do October 1st. You've already heard it doesn't matter about exemption levels or any of that. So for the most part, if you are a steward under these old programs, you're going to have those obligations, and you should be talking to these pros. If you're not sure, let's say you are an importer and you want to call RPRA to talk about that before you start talking to the pros, give us a call. We can help you. The registration process, we're going to talk about dates for that later. It hasn't opened. That doesn't mean you can't call us now to say, I was a producer or as a steward under these rules because I imported everything, but I'm pretty sure I was importing from companies who have residency in Canada and are the brand owner. We can help you figure that out now so that you can say, oh, deep breath, I'm not a producer, so I don't actually need to retain the services of a pro. Okay, next slide. Okay, I'm going to turn that over to Michelle here. I think this is the clue for those of you who have joined us for many, many webinars or consultations before. We're nearing the end.
Thanks, Mary. So before we move forward to the last questions section that we have for the presentation, we will be launching a quick poll just to gather your feedback on today's webinar. This gives us a good understanding of how helpful this webinar was, and we appreciate your participation. It will take 1 minute. So I will launch the poll now. Great, thank you. And now we'll move forward to resources.
Perfect. Okay, so there's a variety of resources that are available to help producers comply, including our website, webinars, and the compliance and registry team. Right now, your obligation to report to RPRA has been changed from what was in the regulation. Originally, it was October 31st of this year. You now have until November 30th. So we are giving producers more time in order to comply with the registration and reporting component. It's not open on our site yet. So if you were to try to go, like I said, it's going to be Excel based, and open up that Excel to say, what am I reporting? How am I reporting? That information isn't there right now. So important to sort of note that. That doesn't mean though that you can't be doing work ahead of time, ahead of that process. So what that means is going ahead and saying, okay, so what information do I need to report? What am I obligated for? How am I going to report it? I think if we actually go back a number of slides, Michelle's mouse may have inadvertently skipped a section on us. I do want to go back. Her mouse appears to have a mind of its own today. So we apologize for this, but here, oh, right, one more down. It's around reporting, Michelle, and reporting deadlines. Here we go. Okay, so as we didn't cover these slides, so we're sorry. That November 30th is the deadline for registration. All producers have to report all of the information as follows. So that's the name, contact information. If you were part of Stewardship Ontario, your Stewardship Ontario number if applicable. If you've retained a pro by the time you register, which you may have and probably should have, since your obligations kick in October 1st and you're reporting this to November 30th. The pro that you've retained, and it may be multiple pros for different materials, and the name of the contact person who has the authority to bind for the company who is submitting this information. So the important note there is that a producer is filling this out. So you can't, the regulation actually explicitly doesn't allow producers to give the registration process to someone else. A producer has to say, I am the one legally obligated for these things. So an important note. So that form's not ready, like I said, but we've already covered a bunch of material that tells you all of the things you should be thinking about in order to get ready for when that form comes out. We have FAQs, so on that resource page, we'll have more of these webinars if it's useful. We'll have QA sessions, just dedicated QA sessions, if that's something that's helpful as well. Next slide. So there are differences in the reporting, much like there are differences in other of the requirements. So if you're a producer of very specific materials listed here, you have to be getting ready to give us your supply data. So that's the weights of 18, 19, 20. Now, I say weights, but we're going to talk about how you report that. And I promised someone who earlier on who was asking about weights of containers that we would cover that. So producers of these materials do have to provide us supply data. For those years, you can start working on getting that supply data now by contacting, your current Stewardship Ontario program operator, if that's who you're with for the material, at Product Care or AMS, pulling those years and asking yourself the questions that came out of this webinar. So at a minimum, that's going to be the data you need. Then you're going to say, am I an antifreeze producer who has factory fill? Am I a paints and coatings producer who has some of those additional materials that are in? Am I an individual who Mary has, I think we also may have skipped the slides on, that spoke about the fact that doesn't matter anymore which sector I supply the material into. It's all obligated now. So you may have been reporting paints and coatings only supplied into the residential sector and only supplied to small industrial IC&I groups. Now it's everything. So you have to take that data that you reported for those years and ask yourself, what's new, what's additional? What do I need to add to it if you're in those categories? For fertilized and refillable propanes, you have no supply data required. You just have to tell us the first date you supplied, right? Next slide. Here's where we spoke a little bit about the key difference that supply data, as I've mentioned and alluded to a few times, is now all sectors. So it's not just the residential as in the consumer. And an important note on how you report the containers, I had promised this earlier, is that the idea that if you reported to Stewardship Ontario, AMS, and Product Care, we'll continue with the example of paints, you would have reported in units, in particular category units. You can continue to report that way to us. So when you see that Excel sheet and it has maybe less than 250 milliliters, whatever the category may be, and you had a number of units, you're going to continue to report that way. You don't need to do any weird conversions. So if you report it in units, you will continue to report in units for now. We'll take care of the work of saying, okay, this producer is using the Product Care input in terms of figuring out their units to weight. They're putting in X number of units for paint or X number of units for oil filters, and we will convert it into kilograms for you using the appropriate weight of the container as well. So you don't need to ask yourself a question of, okay, I'm a paints and coatings producer. Do I now need to take this data I gave to, let's say it's Product Care, figure out how much all of the paint weighed, figure out how much all of the containers weighed? No, just reporting it to us like you did to Product Care for now. For more information about how to do that, you can see we've also got our HSP verification procedure that should help you with it. So next slide. I think that was the section that we inadvertently skipped over there. So we'll go back to the resource section. Does anyone have questions about either the resources available, questions they may have around registration and reporting with RPRE, anything around those lines, or any questions that we haven't covered yet?
Yes, so one question is the registration fee a one-time payment or do we need to renew yearly?
And the registry fees are annual. So every time that you come in and interact with the registry, there's associated fees, but they change annually. So they're reviewed by the board every year.
Someone is asking for clarification on category E producers. Are they only obligated to report dates of first supply as of 2018 and not weight of supply?
Category E producers don't report weight at all. They aren't reporting anything to us. All they're doing is registering with us and saying, I supplied refillable propane containers.
So a question we received earlier about RPRE and the ministry. So someone's asking, what is the role of the ministry in this HSP regulation?
They developed it. So that they're finished. So their role was to develop the regulation, to set the policy, get it to cabinet, and now they're finished. And it is with RPRE. Unless you have things that are concerns. We talked about this a little bit. It would be great if this section didn't include X or said these words instead, so that this obligation changed. You can certainly talk to RPRE about it, but we can't change the regulation. Only the ministry can. So that would be a going forward role for them.
Someone's looking for some support on what's the best way for them to find out, rather than going to a supplier's website to try to figure out if they own that brand and are located in Canada. Do we have any suggestions on a more efficient process for this?
Yeah, you can contact us. We can see what we can do to help to try to figure that out. There's some information that we'll be able to provide. Some of it's obviously confidential, so we can't say things like this person isn't a producer and here's why, right? But we can try to help you with that. So if you've got particular companies that you're saying, I think they're the producer with the residency, you can also contact them. One of the things that we're going to be doing, the manual process for registration this year, because of these tight timelines, does make it very difficult. But we will be posting the names of individuals as they register with us, the individual companies, as well as the contact information for that company. So if you see them up there, you could always reach out to them and say, are you registered because you're the brand owner, resident in Canada, in which case I should remove everything that I'm purchasing from you. Those are sort of things that you can do as well. It's difficult during the transition, and we do recognize that, to sort of figure out who is and who isn't the producer, since those definitions changed.
Someone is asking if all aerosols, is it all aerosols or only those for paints and coatings that are included?
It depends on what we're talking about. If it's a solvent that is an aerosol, it's included. If it's a paint coating that's an aerosol, it's included. If it's an oil container that would have contained it, it would be included. So it depends. But cheese in a can is not included, because the cheese is not obligated.
And someone else is wondering if oxygen tanks, thinners / fuels, sulfuric acids, and aerosol containers are all included.
It's a lot of questions in one. I'd recommend you send that to Registry at RPRE. The first one I heard there was oxygen. Yes, they're in. I didn't hear the rest. So if you want to know specific materials, send it to Registry at RPRE, and they can respond and say whether they're included or not. But if a guiding principle, if they match the definition, so if you read, I didn't catch if those were all pressurized containers or what they were, but if you read the definition and you say, yeah, that's what that is, it's in. If it's not listed explicitly in the regulations, excluded. RPRE will not be developing a list of other things that are excluded. If it's not listed in that regulation, it is not excluded.
Okay, and then a question for you, Monica, is does RPRE have any resources on evaluating pro services?
Right, so we do not approve pros. We do talk to them, and before every pro registers with us, we have different conversations to make sure they understand what a pro is, what their responsibilities are, but we do not approve or vet them at all.
How does Section 40, in brackets, volunteer organizations, relate to producer registration?
Right, so volunteer organizations are companies who are the brand owner and do not have residency in Canada, right? So this isn't like the volunteer remitter concept where we were talking, where those were retail stores, the brand owner had residency in Canada and the retail stores were somehow pushing down their obligation. Voluntary organizations are brand owners who do not have residency in all of Canada. They can choose to say, I sell into the province of Ontario. I sell to all of these different companies, as opposed to making all of those companies obligated as the importers resident in Ontario, I am going to take on the requirement to report. There's still specific obligations that land depending on the arrangement, but to report, to potentially perform, all of that depending on how it works out. So if you are a brand owner who does not have residency in Canada, you can contact us to talk about whether or not that's something that you want to try to figure out. We can assist you with it. As a producer, if you are a resident in Canada, it doesn't work. If you're importer in Ontario and you want to contact us to try to get a company who is resident outside of Canada, we can't help you. It has to be the company who has residency outside of Canada, who's the brand owner, contacting us to sort of figure that out.
Question from Monica. Will RPRE be providing our weight conversion factor like we did for tires and batteries in E before the November 30th deadline?
So we will be providing the conversion factors. So like Mary explained, if you have already reported to AMS, PCA, or Stewardship Ontario, you can use the weight conversion factors. And you can also report the way you used to report to any of those programs.
Thank you. So there's a question just looking for some guidance from us. So as a retailer, if they believe that a supplier is meeting the definition of brand holder in Canada and should be the producer, but the supplier disagrees, how would we suggest going about that?
Just let us know. You don't have to ensure compliance, we do. So if you equally, if you have a competitor who you know or suspect isn't complying, just let us know who they are. We won't say, you know, so-and-so called us and said. We do look into every free rider case and acquisition we get. So we will look into it and work with them.
And someone's asking if the interim 2022 report for category A, B, and C needs to be submitted directly by the producers or the pros, or can the pros submit this report to RPRE?
I assume you're talking about the collection and management report due January 1st, 2022. If that's correct, that can be reported by your pro if you've retained a pro to do that service on your behalf. If you haven't retained a pro to do that service on your behalf, we will expect you to do it. So that gets to that question of, are you fulfilling these obligations yourself or someone else?
Okay, and they are also asking if there is a fee related to this report.
No.
And I believe this is our last question. Someone is asking when our registration form will be made available and other tools.
Yes, so we're updating our FAQ section on our website very regularly. That your main tool is Registry at RPRE, so just emailing the questions over, as well as this webinar, and we will have more webinars if the need is there. The Excel sheet is just that, it's an Excel sheet, it's data entry form. You do not need it to start this work. You should be starting this work of figuring out what you're obligated for, who is it. You do not want to wait for us to give you the Excel sheet. If you do, you risk not being able to submit it on time. So do not wait for the Excel sheet. I can't stress that enough. Start to figure out what you're obligated for now. You don't need this sheet to do that. All the sheet is paint field. So we will be providing that. Very likely we'll be launching the campaign for that at the latter part of October. And we'll be sending it out and contacting folks, posting on our website for individuals who are newly obligated producers and aren't on our contact list. But again, really can't urge you enough that you need to be figuring this out now. If you wait for that sheet and then try to figure out what goes into that sheet, you very likely won't necessarily make the deadline.
Great. Great. Well, that's right on the just 1 minute over. So that's all the questions we received. If anyone has additional questions, again, please reach out to our compliance and registry team at registry@rpra.ca. And we thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you a wonderful rest of your week.